All right, good morning. Thank you all for being here. I'm super excited about today to talk about issues that are somewhat controversial and to discuss some of the latest science and how to possibly put that into application. So I am a dietitian from West LA. I am the founder of a group practice. I have no conflicts of interest. My research at UCLA is primarily focused on nutrition for drug addiction, and it's an emerging field that I have been able to contribute to. And there's a lot of overlap there with eating disorders, gut health, food addiction, and what we're going to talk about today is overlap. We're going to talk about how seemingly opposing truths can converge, how there can be conflict in issues related to nutrition, and how we can start to think about resolving some of that. The work that I do is grounded in the biopsychosocial model of health, which is essentially looking at, again, the integration of all of these different ideas, all the way from the subatomic particle level, bacteria, atoms, you name it, up to the nervous system, person, family, community, all the way to planetary health. So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at problems at the small level, at the local level, or at the global level. And I am very interested in how all of this can come together in an integrated picture. So biopsychosocial has gotten a little popular in the last decade. You can see these are the number of publications in Scopus. And it has a lot of overlap with psychosomatic medicine, which is actually one of my favorite journals. The broad umbrella of what we're talking about is nutrition for mental health. It's come a long way. Originally, nutrition for mental health was looking at vitamin and mineral deficiencies, what perhaps B vitamins or other minerals could be leading to cognitive issues. We learned about some of that this morning at a fantastic presentation, essential fatty acids, amino acids. There was trends in nutrition and mental health. We've always known food and mood, you eat better, you feel better. Emotional eating has always been a buzzword. But now there's a lot of attention on food allergies, food sensitivities, gut health, microbiome, inflammation, and oxidative stress. And we'll talk about some of those things a little bit. That is the more biological focus. But as an eating disorder clinician, I'm also very interested in the psychosocial part of these conditions, which we'll talk about as well. So nutrition for mental health, again, took a very reductionistic approach because that's how nutrition research is done. We look at single nutrients. It's very difficult to look at the bigger picture, right? We know broccoli has health benefits, so researchers will try to figure out what is it in broccoli that gives the benefits and try to isolate those compounds, perhaps sell it as a dietary supplement. And it turns out that the active compound in broccoli is broccoli, right? It's the synergy of all of the things in broccoli, including the fiber, that make a big difference. So today we're going to talk a little bit about fiber. It's one of my strongest belief systems that most people don't get enough, and it can make a really, really big difference. So we'll go there. So nutrition for mental health is about what we eat, but it's also about our relationship to food, right? It goes beyond nutrition. It's about how we eat. It's also about how we think about food. One of my intake questions when I see people in my office is, what percentage of the day do you spend thinking about food and body? Some people say they spend 75% of the day concerned about their body and thinking about food, right? One could argue, and I would, that would constitute as a mental health issue, regardless of how optimized one's physical health might be. So it's important to always consider multiple dimensions of wellness. And then there's interactions between what we eat, how we eat, and how we think about food. And that's in the domain of eating disorders, which we'll talk about today. One of the big breakthrough moments as a dietitian as well as a researcher for me came when I was able to really understand the difference between individual and population health. There's an ecological fallacy when we take facts from the population level and apply it to an individual level. And so it's really important when we get sound bites around nutrition to think about, is this individual health messaging or is this population health messaging? This particular author suggested that the relationship between individual and population health is partially built on the broad dichotomization of medicine into clinical medicine and public health. I like the word dichotomy a lot because it describes how most of us think. A dichotomy is a division or contrast between two things that are or are represented as being opposed or entirely different. So I'm going to throw out some key terms, things that we can think about as I present further information, because one of my main goals is to resolve this idea of something either is or it isn't. One of the big things I've seen in my field is what we call nutritional tribalism. People get really grounded in a particular way of thinking about food. I call it a campsite, and they camp out right there, and then that's the belief system, and they see everything through the lens of that belief system. And it's the reason why something like food addiction has been so controversial. So a couple key terms. A theory is a system of ideas intended to explain something based on general principles independent of that which is being explained. So theories always come with assumptions, and essentially what they do is to allow us to make predictions. My best example is in statistics. We have the central limit theorem, which suggests that if you have enough of a large sample size, you can make certain assumptions about the distribution, and then it would be easy to model. So if I wanted to take the height of everyone in this room, it would fall under a somewhat normal distribution. And because of that normality, there's ways that we could model it. If we wanted to take income, that might be a little bit different. So I've become interested in the way nutrition has created theoretical frameworks and what assumptions go along with those theories. So I learned in my statistics coursework that all models are wrong and some are useful. And this is an important concept, right? Because a lot of what we do in the pursuit of knowledge is build models to try to understand. So scientific modeling aims to make a particular part or feature of the world easier to understand, define, quantify, visualize, etc. So in statistics, we build models to detect associations, which help us to make predictions. Now, this is population health. We also, as individuals, build models in our mind. All day long, we're modeling based on what we've learned, what we've experienced. Perhaps there's trauma, things that have occurred in our nervous system that help us to model and make predictions. It helps us promote survival, detects threats, etc. But it also increases our ability to be efficient and carry out basic tasks. So, for example, a nutritionist might have a food philosophy. This is a model which they have subscribed to. And then anyone who comes into their office will be modeled under that single food philosophy. It makes their job easier. It's really hard to have multiple models and to be able to switch campsites and switch lanes. So most nutrition professionals end up with a food philosophy. And then everyone kind of gets subjected to their personal food philosophy. And that can be very helpful, but it can also be very problematic. So I'm interested in how different disciplines look at problems. Biological theories look at the physical basis for human behavior, things like genetics, neuroscience, microbiome. There's also psychological theories which describe human behavior, family systems, etc. Sociological theories look at the difference between structure and agency, the social determinants of health. And of course, there's overlap. For example, gender theory is an overlap between psychological and sociological, and there's psychobiological theories. You'll get an overlap between two, but very rarely do we have modeling that is able to overlap all three. And it's very, very difficult to do. So a couple key terms. Convergence is the act of converging towards union, a point where two or more data points encounter one another. It's commonality between theories. And then there's divergence, the situation where things become different also known as departure points. So I've become very interested in thinking about different theories and where they converge and where they diverge. Another term that I'm interested in is intersectionality, very common in the social sciences. It's a joint association of multiple categories. The meaning of one category might depend on another. It describes an interplay, also sometimes referred to as an interaction effect in statistics. Another big word for today, dialectics. It's the art of investigating and discussing truths of varying opinions. It's any systematic reason or argument that juxtapose opposed or contradictory ideas and usually seeks to resolve their conflict. It's a method of examining and discussing opposing ideas and or balancing opposites. I'm also very interested in bias and how bias affects nutrition messaging. Bias is an inclination of temperament or outlook. It's systematic error, often introduced into sampling or testing by selecting or encouraging one outcome over another, or it could be an unfair personal opinion that influences judgment. Bias in any stage of inference tends to produce results or conclusions that differ systematically from the truth. And I always like to point out that this green fish feels like the truth, right? But what if there wasn't just one truth, right? What if there were multiple truths in nutrition science? And that's where this is headed. Confirmation bias is an unconscious act of referencing only those perspectives that fuel a pre-existing view while filtering out feedback that does not help in supporting our assumptions. So for example, if someone doesn't believe food addiction is a thing, you can get upset and find evidence or other professionals that can confirm what one believes. Very common on listservs, etc. I'm interested in the bandwagon effect. In my field, there's a lot of groupthink, right? What happens is group members may agree upon a decision that deviates from the correct decision for the sake of attaining harmony or avoiding conflict. When you do something different, people get upset. It's a thing, right? So when new information, it's really exciting to see how all this new information about the gut microbiome is like changing the way people think and view the world. In my field, there's a lot of groupthink, which has created some challenges. Anchoring bias is a tendency to rely too heavily on a first preferred piece of information. Cognitive dissonance is a state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, a feeling of mental discomfort leading to an alteration in one of those attitudes. In essence, when people feel cognitive dissonance, they will take unconscious steps to resolve their discipline. And then I believe this to be one of our last terms. Big one, extrapolation. This is the act of estimating or concluding something by assuming that existing trends will continue or a current method will remain applicable. This is very common in nutrition. This is what works for me, so it should work for you, or this is what works for most of my clients, so it must be what you are experiencing. And there's a lot of extrapolation in the eating disorder community. For example, eating disorders are all about thinness. Eating disorders are all about restriction. Eating disorders are all about control. Wrong, they're not. A lot of them are. But to say they all are and extrapolate what's true for a small group to the entire group can cause a lot of people to feel misunderstood. So I always encourage when I train other professionals to be careful what you learn from manuals. You want to start there, but develop a clinical intuition. Causality describes cause and effect, connects one process with another. And then directionality, which we'll talk about today, the property of being directional or maintaining a direction. So conceptualize the entire spectrum of all food-related issues. There's a lot of different possibilities, and I've just suggested a few, right? Binge eating, food insecurity, autoimmune, food aversions, organ damage. There's all of these different things. We can call them constructs. A construct is a complicated idea, and once it's operationalized, it can be measured. And so once we get a construct, we can use the construct to develop and test theories. Now, in medicine, there is a thing, as we're all aware, called evidence-based practice. The evidence is accessible, hopefully. In nutrition, it just doesn't seem to be the same. It's very hard to conduct randomized control trials with food. It's very challenging, and there is a lack of clear evidence. So when you get a construct, there's a lot of disagreement about what the quote-unquote treatment is. There isn't one thing that's really shown to be the best. So perhaps it can be a meal plan. Perhaps it can be a non-diet approach. Perhaps it can be more life skills, mindful eating. There's so many different things that work, and a lot of convergence and a lot of divergence. So let's think about food addiction and binge eating. I want to discern binge eating and food addiction briefly. Binge eating is classically associated with a more restrained or diet-based pathology, right? Most professionals would agree that the diet precedes the binge, right? Whereas with food addiction, you can have addiction-like binge eating behavior without the presence of any diets ever. So this is one area where they could be separate. Obesity can exist with or without them. They can be completely different things. Now just think about this for a second. What if someone was a professional who specialized in binge eating? And then everyone who they saw, they might see through the lens of binge eating disorder treatment. Perhaps they're doing shame reduction, intuitive eating, emotion regulation. If someone was an obesity professional, they might see all the clients through the lens of their training and their particular treatment approaches. So a lot of clients, patients, are left feeling misunderstood. They went to an eating disorder treatment center, they got a message that was challenging, or they have secretive eating and shame, and they went and saw a medical professional who gave them obesity-like treatment, and people are feeling very confused. So one thing that's important to consider is that constructs don't exist as these clear shapes. There's always a cloud, an error. It could be a subclinical presentation of the issue. There's always outliers, etc. So when we think about something like binge eating, food addiction, and obesity, there's actually much more overlap than one might imagine. If we want to be more specific, it might look something like this. I've become interested in the overlap, right? In other words, it would make sense for someone to get specified training in eating disorders as well as food addiction, and if you believe in that, to be well-versed in all of them, so different people came in, you could do different approaches. But I've become interested in what if people come in with co-occurrence combination factors? What do you do with messaging there? How do you deal with people that might have multiple things going on at the same time? Someone with binge eating disorder might eat the whole box of chocolates in one sitting, whereas someone with food addiction might eat the whole box over several sittings. Addiction like neurochemistry might have someone eat something at 10 p.m. and then have that same brain signal for the same behavior the next night at 10 p.m. It might not be characterized by full loss of control, but there might be a part of the dopaminergic brain system and the memory, which is signaling to repeat the behavior. I did publish a guide on how to discern food addiction from disordered eating that essentially looks at this idea of spectrums, and the idea is one could plot themselves based on where they stand between the 3 known eating disorders, food addiction, and it takes into account a lot of information about drug addiction, substance use disorder. So the way that food addiction has been looked at is by using criteria for substance use disorder. And there's some obvious overlap. For example, when we think about have people that have a desire or unsuccessful efforts to quit their use, continuing to use despite problems, cravings, these are all things that we probably have experienced or know people that have experienced around food. So when it comes to overlap, anorexia has the least amount of overlap. One might argue that the starvation process could become addictive. There are binge purge types that show addiction-like behaviors. But with anorexia nervosa, it is commonly thought of as being less about the food and more so related to other factors. Bulimia got a little bit more overlap. There's lack of control, compensatory behaviors, binge eating, body image disturbance, etc. So there's some similarities to anorexia, but there's some clear differences. One of the major differences with bulimia is in the reward circuitry in the brain. So this came out a few years ago and it really caught my attention. This graph shows increasing weight and increasing food addiction symptoms. So you could see as people have more higher BMIs, they have more of the symptoms of food addiction, which we'll talk about how that's measured. And it kind of begs this question, does food addiction lead to obesity, or does obesity lead to food addiction? Does some of the adipose tissue and the metabolic changes that occur from gaining weight alter brain chemistry, which create addiction-like eating patterns? What's also important to notice is that there's people in the normal weight category that do meet criteria for food addiction. Perhaps this could be those that are in a more bulimic class. And where it gets really interesting is you could see as people get in the underweight category, food addiction symptoms go up. And this is what we understand as being the link between restrained eating and dieting and addiction-like eating patterns. So people that are not eating enough can become obsessed with food and display characteristics that present like food addiction, but are probably more like an eating disorder. So I'm interested in the overlap between eating disorders and addiction. When it comes to nutrition, right, if someone has clear addiction-like symptomatology, there's drug addiction in their story, the brain is looking like it needs an intervention, this big question comes like, what do we do? Do we reduce exposure to addiction-like foods? Most people know that doesn't work really well, right? So we often liberalize the diet because food restriction increases reward sensitivity and promotes rebound binging. So a lot of people that have food addiction, after we sort through it and talk it through, we come to see that a lot of people might have more of a restrained eating and restriction problem, but the mind is very biased towards seeing the binge and very biased against seeing the restriction. Perhaps there's trauma or body image issues. I believe that bulimia and nervosa should be separated into two subtypes, those that are hypo-responsive to reward and those that are hypersensitive to reward. I think this can make a big difference in the way we treat these disorders. Binge eating disorder is similar to bulimia and nervosa, lack of control, eating rapidly when not hungry, marked distress, although there are no compensatory behaviors. There's a lot of overlap between them all, more in the psychosocial domain, shame, body dissatisfaction, maladaptive emotion regulation, restrictive eating. I'm very interested in the link between trauma, which can be PTSD or complex trauma, ACE scores, stress, and how that lends itself to dysregulated eating. And that's where a lot of my research is headed. So currently in the eating disorder community, the idea of food addiction makes people feel really uneasy. It makes people really nervous. A lot of classic eating disorders don't resemble an addiction, and the concern is that educating people about food addiction will cause those who have restrictive eating disorders to deepen into their disorder, become more fearful around food. And it challenges the dogmatic messages of all foods fit, there's no bad foods, eat everything in moderation, a calorie is a calorie, and food is fuel. This is a common kind of language that has been promoted by my field. Moderation is a tricky word. I believe in it, but the word itself is really confusing. It's very subjective, ill-defined, and it's a very appealing message. And I think one of the reasons that I have a problem with it is because the food industry loves it. It kind of exonerates the food industry. If it's personal responsibility, just do moderation. And I think there's a lot of people that can succeed with that, but a lot of people can't. And when the only message people get from a practitioner is you just need to do moderation, a lot of people feel misunderstood and stop seeking help. So a lot of people in my colleagues, researchers, practitioners, make the argument that food addiction doesn't exist and that it stems from disordered eating patterns, and it can all be traced back to dieting behavior, restraint, right? And that if we were to eliminate dieting behavior, all the symptoms of food addiction would disappear. Someone like me, who's a public health and a population health person, has to start to ask this question, well, where does all the dieting come from? Why is there so much dieting in the first place? How do we go further upstream? And I think it can be argued that a lot of the dieting actually comes from food addiction. and highly palatable food environment that we are inundated with highly accessible, highly palatable, addiction-like food, which lend themselves to the dieting behavior. So it's this which came first, the chicken or the egg question. Which comes first, the diet or the binge? And everyone's different. And so part of the work that I do is helping people see and discern between these differences. So the Yale Food Addiction Scale was validated in 2008. It looks at the abnormal desire for sweet, salty, fatty foods. It uses DSM-4 criteria. They've updated to the Food Addiction 2.0 scale based on the new DSM-5. Again, overlap with binge eating, overlap with obesity, but not the same thing. There's a lot of PET scans and biophysical data which shows alterations in brain chemistry with compulsive overeaters and those with drug abuse. One of the main findings is a dysfunction at the dopamine D2 receptor site. So if someone has a decrease in dopamine D2 receptors, there's a likelihood that they're going to have to do more work, consume more foods, drugs, etc., to get the same reward effect. It's still unclear if that's fully genetic or if that can happen environmentally, but it's a hot topic of research. As a dietitian, studying neuroscience has been the key to my success. And it's not just from using a food addiction lens, but when you understand how the brain informs the mind, right? And like, for example, some people say, I love coffee, and what I love about it is the taste, right? And I'll hear something like that, and I'm amused, right? And I don't disagree with that, but I think most people are unaware of what's going on underneath the hood, of how the neurochemical effect of the caffeine and the other parts of the coffee cue up with the taste and how it creates what is very enticing about it. So dopamine is the major brain chemical involved in addiction. There are others. It's important for motivating people, for creating well-being. Our understanding of it has evolved in the last few years. It's not just about the feel-good, but it's about the memory of the feel-good. So when something is highly rewarding, the brain remembers the highly rewarding experience or substance, and it allows it to circle one back to that to promote survival. Food addiction has blown up in the last 10 years, since 2007, and there's a lot of papers out about it now. And I have been able to contribute. We have an open access sugar addiction article, which mainly looks at animal data. There's definitely animal data, and there is human data, and we're looking at how they are converging. So defining addiction. ASAM calls it a chronic disease of brain reward. ASAM does recognize food as having addictive potential. I think we're clear on the definition of addiction. What we're not clear on is the definition of food. What do we define as food, right? Because if you think about food in its natural state, the way it occurs in nature, it's hardly addictive. But what about highly concentrated byproducts of food? If you look at drugs of abuse, coca leaf that occurs in nature is in a fibrous matrix. But we've learned how to remove the fiber, get the concentrated extracts, and then there's processes by which we can cook that down even further and get a product that wreaks havoc on the human brain. If you look at poppy plant, it's not addictive. Opium becomes more addictive. And then heroin, the most processed version, is highly addictive and is claiming 150 approximately lives per day in the United States. Wheat plant, not problematic. Whole wheat flour is a byproduct, and then we get refined white flour, which we use to make cookies, cakes, etc. You see that we do the same things with food that we do with drugs. We remove the fibers, we make them more potent, more concentrated, and they affect our brains differently. Sugar cane to raw sugar to refined sugar, corn to corn syrup to high fructose corn syrup. So it is the processing that matters. When things are in a high dose and in high concentration, they have a rapid rate of absorption and they affect the brain system differently. So it's an important discernment to make, but the question is like, what do we do, right? What do we do about all of this? My colleagues investigated which foods are the most addictive, and I'm sure some of you might start to make some guesses. I have the top 8. First one is chocolate. There's other compounds in chocolate that are neurochemical in nature. Ice cream, French fries, pizza, cookie, chips, cake, popcorn, and cheeseburger. So it's important to acknowledge that it's never just like sugar alone or fat alone. It's usually a combination of sugar, salt, and fat. And the combination of these things create a highly stimulating neurochemical effect. As an addiction researcher, I've become really interested in the discernment between wanting and liking. Wanting is mostly the dopamine system. It creates the motivation, the drive, the craving, whereas the liking of something is the actual euphoria that's experienced. So what we're seeing with addiction is that the wanting is increasing and the liking is decreasing. So people want it more than you did before, and you actually experience less euphoria. We've also become interested in how the life course affects addiction-like brain chemistry. In other words, how does what a mother eats during pregnancy affect the neurodevelopment of an offspring? We have seen in animal models evidence of addiction transfer that begins in utero. Maternal ingestion of highly palatable foods can impact fetal neurodevelopment. So you feed a mouse model, Oreos and all of those things, and it can actually affect the brain chemistry of the offspring. So one of the major kind of arguments that we're starting to make is like, if we can't intervene at the individual level, maybe we can intervene at the life course level. Because, for example, in the animal models, if you give the mothers highly palatable food, the offspring are even more susceptible to drug addiction. So what if the food environment that we've created in the last 40, 50 years is fueling the drug addiction epidemic? And I'm interested in this topic. The timing matters. Junk food consumed during pregnancy can have lasting effects on the offspring. So, but again, I've also seen if a mother during pregnancy is very diet-like and is restrictive, that can cause major problems too. So overconsumption is a problem. Underconsumption is a problem. They're both problematic, and this is in humans. So to start kind of bringing it all home, this converges at the gut level. This is the future of behavioral health. I'm really interested in the work they're doing in Ireland. As a drug addiction nutritionist, we are starting to see where all of these different substances, including psychotropic medications, are affecting gut bacteria and how that affects behavior. We heard about it this morning. The future is healing the gut. Even if there isn't strong evidence of gut dysfunction, we all could benefit from a gut tune-up. I'm a dietitian. I thought when I got tested, I would have the best gut bacteria in town. And I don't. I'm a product of West LA. I'm an 80s baby, right? It ain't all good. I heard that there's a black market for fecal transplant. I thought maybe I would have valuable, but didn't check out. I believe that we're doing some harm in the nutrition world by focusing on the mathematical aspect of it. The calorie thing has got to go. A calorie is not a calorie. It is about the food. Just talk therapy, education is not enough. We do need a public health intervention. I do think that in time we can approach some of the food industry the way that the tobacco industries were approached. And I don't think without that we stand a chance based on what we know about neurochemistry. So the Western diet's low in fiber, it's high in sugar, it's high in artificial sweeteners, and it's high in inflammatory fats. The solution is the reverse, a diet that's high in fiber. If there was one thing that everyone could do if you were interested in making changes, if you were going to track something, is get 30 to 40 grams of fiber per day, not from supplements, from whole foods. If there was one thing, if the whole world ate 30 grams of fiber per day, it would be a safer place. And I mean that at the planetary level and at the individual personal level. One of the most important things I do with people is just work on fiber. And it's hard because stomachs are not fiber friendly, especially if someone's been on opioids or other drugs for a little while. The gut is impaired, so a nutrition intervention is ineffective until the gut is capable of even breaking down fiber. So sometimes with people, I just do one baby carrot at a time. And then we go the next day to 2. And then we just build up enzymes. So it is an important piece, and I believe that fiber is going to be a key part of mental health. fiber is the future of mental health, and it's called nutritional psychiatry, and there's a lot to it. But I'm not talking about fiber 1 bars. I'm not talking about fiber supplements. I'm talking about fiber that comes from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. People don't eat enough beans. I'm like, it's like beans is the thing. It's got the fiber, it's got the protein, and it's got so many of the things that we need. And a lot of people don't eat it because like it kind of just doesn't sit right. You can change your nutrition to make it sit right. Not always. Some people will have issues. But I believe that one bite at a time with some other things, we can make a difference. I do move people off of refined grains onto whole grains. Of course, if they have an eating disorder and they're super restrictive and rule-based, some of these things are problematic. Do you understand why I started with all that information? As a practitioner, it's always do no harm. But I believe when you come from the do no harm with nutrition, and you're just like, oh, all food's fit, don't worry, you get nothing done, right? But I also know that dieting can be life-threatening. I've seen people go on their first diet and they end up for the rest of their life with loss of control eating or in an eating disorder treatment program. So being able to balance that is the real art of nutrition and dietetics. Omega-3, if you don't eat fish, flax seeds, walnuts, chia seeds. I do get people into other forms of fermented foods. They've gotten real popular. And like individually, all these things don't do all that much, but collectively, they can make a difference. Another thing that I focus on is timing. I had an eating disorder client who was with me for a long time and then got some recovery and wanted to come back for a session and was like, I want to know what to eat. And I said, let's just focus on when to eat. And we just set up the times that she ate. And that was an effective intervention as opposed to getting too caught up in the what. The big picture goals are typically not weight focused. We focus on overall health, behavior change, recovery, eventually developing a relationship with food and exercise that is intuitive and personal, avoiding the quick fix whenever possible. Intuitive eating is really popular. It's based on an assumption that we can trust our body wisdom. And I would say if someone has a stable gut and they're not dealing with addiction or hormones that are off the chart or under the chart, and they've been trained in mindfulness, then yes, you can assume someone's in sync with their intuition. But if their gut is in dysbiotic state, there's cravings, withdrawal, hormonal extremes, it's biologically implausible for one to be in an intuitive state. And to assume that someone should and then they fail leads people towards distrust of nutrition practitioners. So we need to integrate the biology with the psychosocial factors. The distinction between good and bad can cause more harm than good. However, we can start to discern between real food and processed food, non-addictive and addictive food, and then as we're kind of all talking about today, gut healing versus gut harming. Eating disorder behaviors to watch for: skipping meals, dieting, lots of emotional charge around food. People want to convert others to their way of eating, leaving right after eating for potential purging, laxatives, teas, weight loss supplements, hiding food, playing with food. One of the interventions I do with people when they come into my office is look at who they're following on Instagram. They're following other people's bodies and they're looking at fitness and motivation stuff all day. It can cause problems for a lot of people. Compare us to despair, and it's really important part of nutrition messaging. Nutrition and body go hand in hand. So there is a tool for assessing food addiction. It's called the YALE Food Addiction Scale. Whenever I use it, I also assess for eating disorder symptomatology because the eating disorder might be driving the food addiction and vice versa. I also look for other addictions: caffeine, nicotine, gambling, sex. Some food addicts are only addicted to food. Always assessing for all or nothing thinking. I don't just look at what medications people are on, what medications they used to be on. A lot of people that were on Adderall, Ritalin in their early 20s have dysregulated eating in their mid-30s and late 40s. And there are links between appetite suppressant medications and disordered eating. And those things are super important. Just because someone thinks they're a food addict, it doesn't mean they are. Food addiction treatment does not require abstinence always. It can. It can. Some people have no choice but an abstinence-based approach. But it does require recovery, psychosocial support. Brains can be rewired. Self-destructive black and white thinking can be challenged. I do believe the composition of the food we eat has a profound effect on our microflora, which can affect our mental health. We need to look beyond quantity, and we need to really start the conversation about nutritional quality. So I used to have a slide that kind of summarized my food philosophy in a way that kind of was multi-campsite-ish. and covered all the bases. And I've recently evolved to say that my food philosophy is that I don't have one. I'm not married to a food philosophy. I do different things with different people. People come into my office and they get different handouts and different language and different messages. And that's the key to nutrition counseling. I always remind people that if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So you want to diversify your toolkit.